BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be taking a look at games that are based after animes, and this one just happens to be one of my favorites, and that's Macross. Or the full title is the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, but yeah, that's a little bit of a tongue tie. And then there's the American name, which is Robotech, but I'm not going to get too much into that detail. Well anyways, this is one of my many favorite animes that came out in the 80s, and it is indeed a mecha show. Now, I already did a review on this series already, so I'm not going to talk too much about the story, but basically, the main character is named Hikaru, and he always wants to become a pilot, and then of course he ends up rescuing a chick named Miss Minmay, and he's also really inspired by someone named Roy Fokker. Yeah, that's right, Fokker, not Fucker! And there is also an alien race called Zentradi, who are a bunch of assholes who want to destroy the Earth. And the Super Dimension Fortress just happens to be a big city that's floating around in space. So yeah, I think that's even more simpler put than what I said in the anime feature, but anyways, yes, it's a very simple story that I just really love a whole bunch, mostly because of the characters and the writing and whatnot. And with a show like this, it's expected that there would be games after it. In fact, there's actually quite a few, but I'm not going to be taking a look at all of them here. I'm only going to be taking a look at 3. So first, we're going to start with the Famicom, then we're going to go to the Super Famicom, and then lastly will be the PS1. But one thing that is really interesting is that the very first game that happened to be based after this series is on the system called the Arcadia 2001. And there's also been a whole bunch of games released on computer systems like the MSX, the PC 9801, and all that kind of stuff. But last one I'll mention, just because I found it interesting, is that they actually have a Laserdisc game. So yes, there's quite a lot of different games based after the Macross series, and well, I'll be taking a look at these at some point later on in time. But for now, let's take a look at the Famicom one, which is just called the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, and that's it. And as to be expected, it's a shoot 'em up, and it's also developed and published by Namco. And it was released in 1985, the same year that the NES came out. Also, one thing I should mention is that every single game I'm taking a look at in this video is only going to be released in Japan. Hence why I'm calling it the Famicom and the Super Famicom and all that. So now, let's begin with the gameplay of the original Super Dimension Fortress Macross. So there's not much of a story here being explained, but it's basically everything you need to know. You know, you're using Hikaru, who is riding the F1 Valkyrie, and you gotta shoot the shit out of some Zentradi fools. But before you do start up the game, first thing you see is Minmay in the Chinese outfit ringing the gong, letting you know that you just gotta get the hell out of here and just shoot up a bunch of shit. And it's exactly that. You move around, you just shoot a bunch of Zentradi fools, and yep, that's really all about it. And of course, just like in the show, all the vehicles can transform, and you all have 3 forms. So you know, you got the airplane mode, then you got the mode where it kind of looks like a half airplane with legs, then you got like the mecha form. But let me get back to the transforming thing in a sec there. So after you shoot up a bunch of enemies and you survive, you get to go inside a big green ship, and once you enter inside there, then there's a time limit, and you gotta defeat a boss, which basically all you gotta do is just clear out the blocks and make sure that the whole thing detonates. And after that, it's big bang boom, you're done. And you get to continue on to the next stage, and the next stage, and the next stage, and the next stage, and yeah, this game actually is an infinite loop. So it really is like an arcade style game, since it really has no ending. And the more levels you go by, the harder it gets, and the longer it feels. And that's literally about it. But like I said, I gotta talk about the transforming. So basically, when you want to transform, all the forms do play differently a little bit. So the standard Valkyrie form does shoot pretty quickly, but unfortunately you move slow as shit. And as for the giant mech form, you actually move really quickly, which is nice, but unfortunately the thing that sucks about it is that you actually shoot in any direction that you're facing. So basically, if you press back, you'll end up shooting back, which can be kind of annoying considering that I like to have tried to avoid everything, and it's just kind of hard to shoot things like that. And it also doesn't help that you're also a pretty big target. And as for the last mode, which is actually called the Gurwalk, but I just like calling it airplane with legs just because that's exactly what it looks like to me. But either way, it's called a Gurwalk. And this is the mode that I can recommend playing in if you do want to play this game, because it does move decently fast. Of course, it's not like super fast, but it's good enough. It shoots pretty fast enough, and well, you're always shooting forward, which is good. So I'd say that one has like the least of your issues, where all the other ones just have some really annoying issues. But one last thing I should mention is that when you press select, you can shoot a whole bunch of micro missiles, which is pretty great. So yeah, that's the gameplay. It's a simple shoot 'em up where you get to transform and it never ends. So now, let's talk about the graphics, and well, for the time when this game came out, the graphics do look pretty nice for what they are. Now sure, it doesn't have like a whole lot of crazy detail, but at least you can tell what everything is, since, you know, like your ship actually looks like the ship from the show, and of course like the enemy ships are very recognizable. So it's good that everything is at least recognizable to the show and not just made up in someone's imagination. So for a game on the Famicom that came out in 1985, this does look pretty good for the time. Of course nowadays it looks simple as hell, but you know what, that's just how it was back then. So I'll give it a pass, and as for the music, there's only one song in this game, and it's a song that does play in the show, and it's called Little White Dragon. It's a song that Minmay sings. And the actual song itself is actually pretty catchy, I kinda like it, but as for the 8-bit rendition, I do think it does sound pretty good, although it does get kind of annoying after a while because it is the only song that plays in this game, except for like when you die or when you start a level, it's like dun 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 dun. But at least the song is very recognizable, and it is rendered pretty well. I just kinda wish there was more music in the game, but that's just my only complaint, but otherwise, I think it is pretty good. And oh shit, I just totally forgot to talk about the controls. Well, I'm also talk about them here. So the controls for the most part are very simple and easy to understand, so, you know, not a whole lot to say there, but are they at least responsive? I'd say they kinda are, but of course, if you use the standard mode, then it just feels slow as shit. Which is kind of annoying, but otherwise, I think it does work fine for what it is. So now, if you want to buy this game, well, obviously because it is only released in Japan, you're most likely going to have to import it, but unfortunately, I was not able to find a copy of it on eBay. So sadly to say, I really can't say a general price point of what it would go for because, well, I just couldn't find the damn thing. But there is some good news. I know this game usually does get packed in with a few multi-cards, so if you do have some multi-cards on the NES that contain like a shitload of games, usually it's pretty common that this game would come in with that, so yeah, there is that. But as for the standalone cart, well, yeah, I just can't say anything about that. Sorry guys. So now, what are my overall thoughts on this game? Well, if you played this game nowadays, it really isn't anything all that special, but if you played this game like way back in the day, then yeah, you probably would have enjoyed the hell out of it. And of course, if you lived in Japan, or if you knew about importing games from Japan around that time. But anyways, the point is that this game is okay, but it's definitely not great, but not bad either. It's just pretty stereotypical shit that we've seen like a bajillion times. But if you are a huge fan of the anime like I am, then it's at least worth checking out just for that. But otherwise, it's a pretty typical game that came out in 1985. And that's not a bad thing, mind you, it's just, you know, it's one of those games that just feels really dated. So knowing this, you kinda have to take it for what it is. It's kinda like playing one of those launch games that came out on the NES that had the black boxes, where they are pretty fun games for what they are, but sometimes you just gotta expect it for what it is for the fact that they're mostly really short games. So that's all I have to say about the first Macross game that we're taking a look at. It's just plain okay, and there's nothing much else to say about it. So the next one we're going to be taking a look at here is Super Dimension Fortress Macross Scrambled Valkyrie on the Super Famicom. And it was developed by Winkysoft and published by Zamooz. Winkysoft? I don't know why that amuses me. And it was also released in 1993. And as again, it's another shoot 'em up, but this time, this one is kind of more or less based after the movie, Macross, Do You Remember Love? Although it does get pretty complicated because it's actually supposed to be a parallel world timeline thing, and well, that's just a whole lot of confusion thing that I just don't want to get into here because it's just fucking unnecessary. But anyways, there's not much I can say about the story that I already have and said before, so what's it moving on to talk about the gameplay. So it's another side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, just like the Famicom one, but this one is a hell of a lot more improved. So the one good thing that they added in here is that you can actually select your character. So of course, there's the main character, Hikaru, then there's Maximilian Genius, because haha, he's a genius. And finally, there's Milia. And all the characters have different power-ups for each form. So you get the 3 same forms that you get in the first game, but this time every single form gets a different type of shot, and of course every character has different multiple types of shots, like, you know, it can either be like a spread fire, it could be a laser gun, it could be like a whole lot of other ones. So at least there is variety here. And as to be expected from a shoot 'em up, you can also get some power-ups, and whenever you get these power-ups, you know, your shots are much more stronger, but once you do get hit, your power-up does get lowered down by 1. But one interesting mechanic that they have in this game is that if you don't fire your weapon for a certain amount of time, your ship will start glowing, and if you touch certain enemies after a certain amount of time, you can touch certain enemies and you can gain an invincible ally for a short amount of time, which is pretty cool. At first I had no idea what this was supposed to be. I assumed it was supposed to be a stronger shot, but no, it's actually a lot more better than I thought it was. And this time around we got some pretty recognizable bosses, and there's just a shitload of things happening all at once. It's actually a pretty crazy shoot 'em up if I say so myself. So with that being said, yes, this shoot 'em up is pretty fucking hard. But thankfully, this game is not crazy hard because it's cheap, it's crazy hard for a reasonable challenge. But I can understand the frustration with certain levels. So that's all I really have to say about this one, is that it really is a really big improvement over the other one. But it really doesn't take a genius to figure it out. So now, let's start talking about the controls, and finally I'm back on track with this stuff. So the controls in this game are very good, very smooth, very responsive. I really have no complaints about it whatsoever. Also, the button layout is really good, everything is easy to figure out, and well, if you know how to play a shoot 'em up, then you should know how to play this game. So overall, there's nothing much I can say here, it's just really good. So now, let's start moving on and talking about the graphics, and all I have to say here is that the graphics in this game are fucking awesome. So as again, everything is very recognizable, which is always good. There's a whole lot of bright colors and some very nice effects and backgrounds. There's a whole lot of details within this game, and it's very appealing to look at. Hell, even the space background looks nice, and normally you just expect a black background with stars, but no, they decided to take the extra effort and add in a whole bunch of other stuff going on, which is pretty awesome. So yes, when it comes to the overall graphics, it's just really awesome looking. So now, let's start talking about the music, and the music in this game is also pretty awesome. So yes, there are a few songs within this game that are very recognizable, like the opening theme, then there's the song Dogfighter, and even the song itself, Do You Remember Love? But it also contains original songs, which is always quite nice, and they all sound really good, suits the theme, and of course it's very fast-paced action, which also suits this game. But as for the songs that are really recognizable, the 16-bit renditions of them are pretty nice sounding, although I do find that the opening theme could have been done a little bit better, but for the most part, it still does sound pretty epic. So with that being said, the music in this one is still really freaking good. So now, if you want to go out and buy this game, well, as again, you're going to have to import it unless you can just randomly find it within your area. I mean, that's always possible too. But this time I actually did find 2 copies of the game that are both loose, and they both happen to be $59.99 and $77. So yes, this one is on a little bit more of the expensive side since, you know, it is a $60 game that just happens to be a Super Famicom game that is just loose, so yeah, it's kind of a lot for that. But I wouldn't say it's anything super outrageous, like anything over 100, but it is still kind of a lot, especially for a shoot 'em up on a system that is generally pretty cheap to get games for. But I'm talking about the Super Famicom, of course, where the Super Nintendo, on the other hand, is an entirely different story, but I still managed to find some cheap games here and there. But I will go out and say that this really is a great game. It's just kind of unfortunate that it's not really cheap, as you would suspect. But at least there is always emulation out there, so you can go out and try it, and I don't know, maybe there might even be a reproduction card somewhere. So now, as for my overall thoughts on this game, is that this game is pretty damn fantastic. And I'll be quite honest, this might actually be one of the best shoot 'em ups I've played on the system. And that's saying something because there's quite a few shoot 'em ups on the Super Nintendo and the Super Famicom, and well, this one is just really fucking good. So if you love shoot 'em ups, I can definitely recommend it for that, and I can also recommend it if you're a fan of the anime, definitely on that too. But one thing I will bring up is that even if you're not a fan of anime, but you still like shoot 'em ups, then I can also recommend it for that too. Just one example of a game that you wouldn't think is based after an anime, but it actually is the game UN Squadron. But of course, that's the North American name, where in Japan it's called Area 88, where it's based after an anime with the same name. I just wanted to mention that because this game kinda does remind me of that. So yes, Scrambled Valkyrie is definitely awesome sauce, not only for the fans of the anime, but also just as a game in general. But with that said, this game is definitely not easy, but it is still a really good time fun challenge. And now, we're going to be taking a look at the last Macross game that I'm going to be talking about within this video. And this one just happens to be the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, Do You Remember Love? So yes, this indeed is a movie license game. And we're going to be taking a look at the PlayStation version, which came out in 1999, but interesting enough, it was actually released first on the Sega Saturn in 97. And it was developed by Scrambled and published by Bandai. And in case you're wondering who the hell is Scrambled, well, they later changed their name to Field Plus Inc. And Field Plus Inc. is the company that helped out Mistwalker put out the game Lost Odyssey. And this is the company where some of the employees from Nautilus, aka the creators of Shadow Hearts, moved to. Same thing with Square Enix. So that's a little bit of background info on Scrambled that I found to be pretty interesting. So anyways, back to the game. As I said before about the other games, it's another space shooter, but this one sticks more closely to the film. So there's not much I will say about the story, since if you've seen the movie, then this is pretty much the exact same thing, although there are some changes, but for the most part, it's pretty much the same. So anyways, on to the gameplay. You move around, you shoot at shit. There are 3 different modes that you can transform into, and they all play the same. But when you hold the button down, you can shoot out a whole bunch of micro missiles. And not only do these things like scatter around all over the place, but you can also hit things within the background, which is pretty cool. But other than that, there's really not much else I can say that already has been said before. But one thing that is pretty cool about this one though is that at certain points in the game, like if you fight a boss battle, sometimes the perspective will change. Like an enemy will appear in the background, your ship will be shooting within the background when you're in the foreground. It's a nice touch that you don't see too often within shoot 'em ups. And that's all well and good, but one thing I do find annoying with this game is that they have way too many enemies that appear right behind you, which can be really hard to avoid. But another thing that makes it hard to avoid things is that your sprite is pretty damn huge. But other than that, it's a pretty typical shoot 'em up. And I'll get into more details about that later on. So anyways, now we'll start moving on and talking about the control. And as I said before, the controls in this game feel really nice. So everything is really easy to understand. And it also runs really smoothly, so really, I don't have any complaints whatsoever. So the controls in this one are really good. Now yeah, it does kinda suck that you can't use the analog stick, but even with using the D-pad, it still works really well. So okay, maybe that might be my only complaint, but it's just a minor thing. Now as for the graphics in this one, now I find them to be really nice. In fact, everything kinda looks like it's all digitized, and usually I'm not a huge fan of that, but I have to admit, everything here does look pretty good. The backgrounds are also pretty good considering the time that this game was made, but probably the best part of the game would have to be the cutscenes. I think it looks pretty impressive playing this on PS1. And just like the show's animation, which is pretty top notch, this one is also pretty good too. Of course, I'm not talking about today's standards, but I'm talking about back when the PS1 was the newest thing. So at least everything is very recognizable, and it's just done pretty well. But one thing I do have a complaint, although it is also a minor thing, is that I do find that the title screen in this game looks ugly as fuck. So first of all, the font that they use for the title just looks really boring and looks like something they used in MS Paint. And secondly, the picture's like blurry as fuck. Now of course you can at least tell what things are, but I mean really, did they have to make it look like that? So that's really my only complaint with the graphics, is that the title screen is just really beyond ugly. But I really don't think someone is just gonna like see that and go like, oh god, I'm not gonna play this game anymore because that thing is just so ugly. But I just really wanted to make fun of it, but really there, it just does look pretty damn bad. But everything else about the graphics does look pretty good for the time. So now, let's start talking about the music, and the music in this one is also pretty damn awesome. But there's nothing real specific I can say about it, considering that all the music in this game is also taken from the movie as well. So if you love the soundtrack from the movie like I do, then yes, you'll definitely love the music within this game. And the quality of each song also does sound really good as well, so as again, I don't really have any complaints about the music. So as again, very recognizable and is also very well done. Now as for the voice acting, most of the voice actors that appeared in the movie also do happen within this game, and of course it's all in Japanese. But one thing that is really unfortunate to hear is that the voice actor who played the main character Hikaru actually died in the year 1996, a year before the original release of this game. So for his lines, they actually had to reuse them. So even though I can't speak Japanese and I can't really judge the quality too well, as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty faithful, and I'm sure it is also pretty good. So now, if you want to buy this game, I only found 2 of them on eBay for the PS1 version, and it's about $35, but as for the Saturn one, there's actually a whole bunch of them, and they're usually about $20 to $25. Although there was one being sold for $50, but I think that one's a little bit too much compared to the other ones, and I don't really see why it's so much more, but whatever. But just for the sake of having more options, you can also download this game on the PS3's PSN if you have a Japanese account. So it seems like the PS1 version is typically more expensive than the Saturn one, but at least with Saturn games, if you want to import them and play them, then at least it's much more easier to get those working on a North American console. So at least this game isn't too outrageously expensive, even when you have to import them. So now, before I give away my overall thoughts on the game, there is some pretty interesting stuff that came with this game when it was first released. So first of all, this game has 2 discs, and no, this game is not super crazy long where it actually takes up 2 discs. The second disc actually has video footage from the original movie, plus some new animated sequences, which is pretty nice. Also, interesting enough, there was an in-mail gift only for the first release of the PS1 version, and it came with a what-if scenario, so maybe that's why that the PS1 version is typically a little bit more than the Saturn one. And lastly, I'll mention there's also some new audio dialogue that was recorded by the voice actor who played Minmay. So there is some pretty good extras that you do get within this game. So now, as for my overall thoughts on the game is that this game as an adaptation is pretty damn good. However, as a shoot 'em up as its own, it's kind of average. And the reason I say that is because there's really not a whole lot of enemies that you see on screen. And because of that, this game is actually pretty damn easy, except for the fact that, you know, some of the enemies will come up right behind you, which is annoying. And then there's one mission where everything's flipped around, and it's just really hard to get used to that. But otherwise, it doesn't really put up a good enough challenge. I mean, everything is either it's too easy or it's just too annoying. And I'd say that this game is at least a little bit better than the Famicom version, but not by a whole lot. But as for the Super Famicom version, that one totally blows this one up into annihilation. But don't get me wrong, this game isn't bad or anything, it's just, you know, it's just not great for a shooter. But if you are a fan of the movie, or of Macross in general, then yes, you will definitely have some enjoyment within this game, because this game is pretty much like an experience of that. And because I'm a fan of the series and the movie itself, then yes, I did have some enjoyments with this game, but as a typical shooter, it's just not that great. So if you're not a fan of the series or the movie or just not a fan of anime in general, then you would most likely not like this game, since this game is pretty typical stuff but really isn't anything all that great, but isn't really bad either. So it's kinda hard for me to recommend this one, but like I said, if you are a fan of the series or anything like that, then yes, this game is definitely worth trying for that. But otherwise, it's just okay, and it is definitely not the best shooter you'll ever play on the PS1, since there's a whole lot of them. So I'll just end it off and just say that it's okay. So those are 3 examples of video games based after the Macross series, which just happens to be one of my favorite animes. So the first one we took a look at on the Famicom was just kinda okay, but it was pretty good for the time, but just going back to it now, it's just not really all that special. And as for the one on the Super Famicom, that one was just fucking amazing, and even if you're a fan of the anime or not, it's still a great game. And as for the last one I took a look at on the PS1, in general, it's an okay game, but it's more about the fan service to, well, you know, the fans. But if you're someone that wants to play a really awesome shoot 'em up, then that one wouldn't be it. And as I said at the beginning of the video, there's a whole slew of them more, but I might take a look at those at a later date. In fact, I was actually thinking about taking a look at the PS2 game, but I decided to change that. So there is always potential to see more. But before I end it, there's actually 2 interesting games I will talk about here briefly that are actually cancelled games. So the first one I want to mention here is Macross VF X2, which is another PS1 game, but this one is actually more like a 3D shooter. Now, the game was released in Japan, but it was actually the North American localization that got cancelled. But oddly enough, the game was pretty close from being finished, but it ended up being re-released by a company called Tokyo Stack in a limited run with non-commercials or promotional items. But since Japan already got the original version, this one was changed to Macross VF X2 Special Version. And because this thing was very limited and wasn't really promoted well, I would assume that this version is probably insanely rare and expensive. And now, as for the last game, and this one is actually kind of interesting, it was actually a game on the N64, and it is called the Super Dimension Fortress Macross Another Dimension. And weirdly enough, this one was also supposed to get a North American release, but it was supposed to be called Robotech Crystal Dreams. And the game was supposed to be developed by GameTech, but unfortunately it was never finished, and it ended up closing down in 1998. That's the basic of what you need to know of the reason why this game was cancelled. There's actually a few other reasons why, but it gets kind of complicated, and I might actually do a video talking about that separately. But one last thing I will have to mention about it that is interesting is that you can actually get a prototype ROM of it to play on your emulator. So at least the game is somewhat playable, but of course, whenever you do try to play these unreleased games out of prototypes, there's always going to be some issues, but that's to be expected. But there is always a possibility that people could fix up games that were never finished. So anyways, I think I went on a little bit too long enough. So let's end things here and say, thank you for watching, commenting, and have yourselves a great day.